The clatter of expensive silverware and the hum of high society gossip usually felt like home to Elias Thorne. As a self-made millionaire, he was used to being the most important man in the room. But when a tired waitress stumbled near his table, his breath caught in his throat and his world stopped spinning. It was Sarah. The woman he had loved and lost years ago was now wearing a stained apron and carrying a heavy tray, but that wasn't the most shocking part. She was heavily pregnant. In that single, heart-stopping moment, the glittering lights of the restaurant faded, and a cold, hard truth began to settle in his chest. Fate had just forced a door open that he thought was locked forever, and the secrets behind it were about to change everything he knew about his life. The Golden Leaf was the kind of establishment where a single bottle of wine cost more than most people made in a month. Elias sat at his usual corner table, the leather of the chair cool against his tailored suit. To the world, he was a titan of industry, a man who had conquered the real estate market with a ruthless efficiency and an unbreakable focus. Yet, inside, there was a quiet void that no amount of profit could fill. He was dining with potential investors, nodding at the right times and offering sharp, calculated insights, but his mind was elsewhere. He often felt like a ghost in his own life, haunted by the memory of a woman who had walked away when things got difficult. Sarah had been his moral compass, the person who loved him before he had a cent to his name. Their divorce 5 years ago had been messy, fueled by his obsession with work and her feeling like an afterthought in his grand design for success. As the main course was being served, a commotion near the kitchen doors caught his eye. A waitress was struggling with a large tray of appetizers. She moved with a cautious, swaying gait that Elias recognized instantly. When she turned to face the room, the dim amber lighting hit her features, and Elias felt a physical jolt in his heart. It was Sarah. Her face was thinner, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of exhaustion, but her beauty remained undeniable. She looked older, more weary, yet she carried herself with a quiet dignity that he had always admired. As she stepped closer to serve a nearby table, the profile of her body became clear. She was at least 7 months pregnant. The sight was like a physical blow to his ribs. Elias found himself unable to look away. He ignored the question his business partner had just asked him, his eyes locked on the woman who had once been his entire world. She was wearing a cheap, synthetic uniform that looked uncomfortable against her skin. He watched her hand tremble slightly as she set down a plate of seared scallops. This was the woman who used to dream of opening her own art gallery, the woman who laughed at the rain and made him feel like he could fly. Now, she was scrubbing tables and taking orders from people who didn't even look her in the eye. The injustice of it burned in his throat. He felt a surge of protectiveness that he had no right to feel, mixed with a crushing guilt. Sarah finally looked up, her gaze sweeping across the room as she checked on her assigned tables. For a split second, her eyes met his. The recognition was instantaneous. He saw the color drain from her face, leaving her ghostly pale. She didn't drop the tray, but she gripped it so hard her knuckles turned white. For a moment, time seemed to stretch thin, the noise of the restaurant muffling into a dull roar. He saw the flicker of pain, then the flash of pride, and finally, a mask of professional indifference that she forced over her features. She looked away quickly, focusing on her task with a sudden, frantic energy. Elias felt a desperate need to stand up, to grab her hand, to demand answers. Instead, he sat frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He realized then that his dinner meeting was over. He couldn't hear a word being said. All he could see was the curve of her belly and the way she winced as she shifted her weight. He had to know the truth. He had to know if the life he had built was a hollow shell compared to the reality he had just walked back into. Elias waited until his associates finished their meals, his responses becoming short and distracted. As soon as they stood up to leave, he signaled for the check, but his eyes never left the kitchen door. He watched Sarah move back and forth, her movements becoming slower as the night wore on. She was clearly in pain, her hand frequently reaching around to support the small of her back. Every time she passed his table, she looked everywhere but at him. She was avoiding him with a desperate intensity that only made his curiosity burn brighter. When the restaurant finally began to empty and the late-night shift change approached, Elias walked toward the back hallway where the staff lockers were located. He knew he was overstepping, but the silence between them was a scream he couldn't ignore. He found her leaning against a cold brick wall near the service exit, her eyes closed and her breath coming in shallow gasps. She looked fragile, stripped of the bravado she had shown on the floor. When she heard his footsteps, her eyes snapped open, and she immediately straightened her back, trying to hide her discomfort. She looked at him with a mixture of defiance and exhaustion. She asked him what he was doing there, her voice a low whisper that vibrated with suppressed emotion. Elias looked at her, his gaze dropping to her stomach before returning to her eyes. He asked her how long she had been working like this and why she hadn't reached out. He reminded her that they had shared a life together, that he would have helped her regardless of their past. Sarah let out a bitter, hollow laugh that echoed in the narrow hallway. She told him that she didn't want his charity and that she had learned a long time ago that his help always came with a price. She explained that after the divorce, she had tried to rebuild her life on her own terms. She had moved away, started over, and worked 3 jobs to keep her head above water. Elias felt a wave of shame. He had been living in a penthouse while the woman he once promised to protect was struggling for basic survival. He stepped closer, reaching out as if to touch her shoulder, but she flinched away. The movement hurt him more than any words could. He asked her the question that had been burning in his mind since the moment he saw her. He asked her who the father was. The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of old grease and expensive perfume. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filling with tears that she refused to let fall. She told him that it didn't matter who the father was because he wasn't in the picture. She said she was doing this alone, just like she had done everything else since the day he chose his career over their family. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. He remembered the arguments they had toward the end of their marriage, the way she had begged him to slow down, to consider starting a family. He had always told her the timing wasn't right, that they needed more security, more money, more prestige. Now, here she was, carrying a child in the middle of a struggle he couldn't even fathom. He looked at her worn-out shoes and the way her ankles were swollen. The millionaire felt like the poorest man on earth. He told her she couldn't keep doing this, that it wasn't safe for her or the baby. Sarah snapped back, telling him that she had no choice. She had no health insurance, no savings, and no one to turn to. She had been pushed to the edge, and the only thing keeping her going was the life growing inside her. As she turned to leave, she stumbled, her foot catching on an uneven floor tile. Elias caught her before she hit the ground, his arms wrapping around her in a way that felt terrifyingly familiar. For a second, she leaned into him, her defenses crumbling, and he felt the small, rhythmic kick of a life against his palm. The physical contact sent a jolt through both of them. For a fleeting second, the walls they had built over 5 years vanished. Elias felt the warmth of her body and the unmistakable movement of the baby against his hand. It was a miracle he hadn't earned the right to witness. Sarah pulled away quickly, her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger. She told him to leave, her voice trembling. But Elias was done taking orders from his pride. He told her he wasn't going anywhere until they had a real conversation. He led her to a small break table in the corner, ignoring the confused glances from the kitchen staff. He sat her down and brought her a glass of water, watching as she drank it greedily. He realized then that she was likely skipping meals to save money, a thought that made his blood boil. He began to talk, not as a businessman, but as the man who used to make her breakfast on Sunday mornings. He apologized. He didn't just apologize for the divorce, but for the person he had become during their marriage. He admitted that he had been blind, thinking that success was measured in bank balances rather than the moments he shared with her. Sarah listened, her expression unreadable, but the tension in her shoulders began to ease. She told him that sorry didn't pay the rent or the hospital bills. She revealed that she had lost her art teaching job when the school closed down, and since then, it had been a downward spiral. She had been too proud to call him, too hurt by the way he had dismissed her feelings in the past. She didn't want him to think she was coming back for his money. Elias looked at her and asked her to be honest with him. He asked her exactly how far along she was. When she whispered that she was 32 weeks, he did the mental math. A cold realization began to wash over him. The dates didn't quite line up with what he knew of her life after him, but they lined up perfectly with a night they had spent together 6 months after their divorce was finalized. It was a night of weakness, a night where they had tried to find comfort in the familiar before realizing the wounds were still too fresh. He looked into her eyes, searching for the truth. He asked her if the child was his. Sarah's silence was more deafening than any shout. She looked away, her bottom lip quivering. She told him that she hadn't known how to tell him. She had seen him in the news, seen his face on the covers of magazines, looking happy and successful. She thought a baby would only be a burden to his perfect life. The revelation hit Elias like a tidal wave. He wasn't just looking at his ex-wife, he was looking at the mother of his child. The child he had claimed he wasn't ready for was only weeks away from entering the world, and its mother was working double shifts on her feet just to survive. The rage he felt at himself was overwhelming. He grabbed her hands, his voice thick with emotion. He told her that he was an idiot, a fool who had lost sight of what truly mattered. He promised her that from this moment on, she would never have to worry about a bill, a shift, or a place to sleep ever again. Sarah started to protest, her independence flaring up, but Elias didn't let her finish. He told her this wasn't about her pride or his guilt anymore. It was about their child. He saw the flicker of hope in her eyes, a tiny spark that had been extinguished by months of hardship. But just as the tension seemed to break, Sarah gasped, clutching her stomach. Her face contorted in pain, and she leaned forward, her breath hitching. The stress of the encounter and the months of physical labor had finally taken their toll. Elias jumped into action, his heart racing. The confrontation was over, and a new, more terrifying battle for their future had just begun. The drive to the hospital was a blur of neon lights and Elias's frantic prayers. He had Sarah in the back of his luxury car, her head resting on a leather seat that felt like an insult to her suffering. He was barking orders into his phone, calling the best doctors he knew, demanding that the maternity ward be ready for their arrival. For the first time in his life, his money felt useful for something other than vanity. He looked in the rearview mirror, seeing Sarah's pale face, and felt a profound sense of terror. If anything happened to her or the baby, he knew he would never forgive himself. He reached back and took her hand, squeezing it tight. She squeezed back, a silent plea for strength that broke his heart into a million pieces. At the hospital, the chaos of the emergency room took over. Doctors and nurses swarmed around them, and Elias was pushed to the side. He stood in the hallway, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling his lungs, feeling completely powerless. He watched through the glass as they hooked Sarah up to monitors. He saw the charts, the flashing lights, and the urgent expressions of the medical staff. A doctor finally came out and told him that the stress had triggered premature labor. They were doing everything they could to stop the contractions, but Sarah was severely dehydrated and malnourished. The doctor looked at Elias with a judgment that he felt he fully deserved. He had to face the reality that while he was winning awards, the person he loved most had been starving in plain sight. Hours turned into an agonizing night. Elias didn't leave the waiting room. He sat on the uncomfortable plastic chairs, his expensive suit wrinkled and forgotten. He thought about the life he had built, the cold, empty mansion and the silent boardrooms. He realized that he had been chasing a ghost of happiness while the real thing had been within reach all along. He made a vow then and there. If Sarah and the baby made it through this, he would spend every second of the rest of his life making it up to them. He would walk away from the business, he would change his name, he would do whatever it took to be the man they deserved. He finally understood that true wealth wasn't what you had in your pocket, but who you had by your side when the world went dark. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, a nurse approached him with a tired smile. She told him that Sarah was stable and the labor had been halted. She was sleeping now, but she had been asking for him before she drifted off. Elias felt a wave of relief so intense he had to steady himself against the wall. He walked into her room, the morning light soft against her face. She looked peaceful, despite the tubes and wires. He sat by her bed and watched her breathe, marveling at the strength she had shown. He realized that she was the strongest person he had ever known. She had carried their child through the darkest valley alone, while he had been basking in a sun that offered no warmth. When she finally opened her eyes and saw him there, she didn't tell him to leave. She reached out her hand, and as he took it, he saw the beginning of a forgiveness he didn't think was possible. They didn't need words. The silence in the room was no longer heavy with secrets, it was light with the possibility of a new beginning. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, promising her that the nightmare was over and that they would face whatever came next together. The weeks that followed were a complete transformation for Elias. He didn't just provide financial support, he showed up. He moved Sarah into a beautiful, quiet home near the coast, far away from the noise of the city and the pressures of his old life. He stepped down as the CEO of his company, appointing a trusted successor and taking a backseat as a consultant. His colleagues were shocked, but Elias didn't care. He spent his days attending doctor's appointments with Sarah, learning about prenatal vitamins, and picking out nursery furniture. He learned how to cook her favorite meals and spent hours talking to her, truly listening in a way he never had during their marriage. They had to navigate the scars of the past, of course. There were days when the old anger resurfaced, but they faced it with a new maturity born of their shared struggle. When the baby finally arrived, a healthy boy they named Leo, the transformation was complete. Holding his son for the first time, Elias felt a sense of purpose that no business deal could ever provide. He looked at Sarah, who was glowing with a tired but radiant joy, and knew that he had been given a second chance that few people ever get. He realized that their separation, as painful as it was, had been a necessary fire. It had stripped away his arrogance and her fear, leaving behind a foundation of genuine respect and love. They weren't the same people who had divorced 5 years ago, they were better, wiser, and more appreciative of the fragile beauty of life. The millionaire who once thought he had everything now knew that he had previously had nothing at all. Sarah eventually went back to her art, but this time, she had the resources and the peace of mind to do it on her own terms. She opened a community art center for underprivileged children, a project that Elias supported with his heart rather than just his checkbook. They became a team, a partnership built on the hard-earned lessons of their past. Elias often thought back to that night at the Golden Leaf. He thought about the tired waitress and the arrogant millionaire. He realized that fate hadn't just brought them together to reveal a secret, it had brought them together to save them both. If he hadn't seen her that night, she might have collapsed alone in that kitchen, and he would have continued his hollow climb to the top of a mountain that offered no view. The lesson they learned was one they shared with everyone they met: your past doesn't define you, but how you respond to the truth does. Love isn't just a feeling, it's an action, a commitment to show up when things are at their worst. Elias Thorne was still a wealthy man, but his assets were no longer measured in stocks and real estate. His wealth was found in the sound of Leo's laughter, the quiet grace of Sarah's smile, and the knowledge that he was finally where he was meant to be. They had turned a tragedy into a triumph, proving that even the most broken stories can have a beautiful ending if you have the courage to face the truth. As they stood on the beach one evening, watching the sun set over the water with their son between them, Elias knew he was finally, truly home. Sometimes, the things we lose find their way back to us, not to remind us of the pain, but to show us how much we've grown. Elias and Sarah's story is a powerful reminder that it's never too late to fix what's broken and that the most valuable things in life aren't bought, they are built with patience, honesty, and love. Life has a way of stripping us down to our true selves just when we think we have it all figured out. Don't wait for a crisis to appreciate the people who matter. Hold them close, listen to their hearts, and remember that every ending is just a chance for a much better beginning.